Hello, my name is Bob Hill. I'm the CEO of the Harrisonburg-Rockingham Association of Realtors. Although housing industry professionals such as developers, builders, lenders, and realtors have been working together to craft solutions for affordable housing over several years, we realized that it was time to bring the public into the discussion. In this community, we are all a part of the solution for every issue we face. If we can find consensus, we can implement solutions to overcoming the affordability crisis. This effort is intended to move the conversation forward by first understanding the forces that impact housing cost and then directing that comprehension toward a plan of action. We hope this will encourage each of you to join the effort to enable the greatest housing availability for the broadest population. And now please welcome Mayor Dina Reed.
Thank you. Affordable and available housing is at the very center of the city of Harrisonburg's vision and priorities plans for the next 20 years. We cannot truly call ourselves the friendly city if we are not doing all that we can to ensure every one of our residents has a safe, affordable place to call home. That's why we are currently conducting a comprehensive housing study and market review to make sure housing insecurity is a thing of the past in Harrisonburg. As mayor, I have addressed our housing needs from multiple angles, developing and maintaining relationships with community organizations, zoning administrators, and developers are all key components to come up with a lasting solution. I know that many of our neighbors are struggling. Because Harrisonburg is a great place to live, we must focus on how to make it affordable. It is going to take a community effort. We know we cannot accomplish our goals of creating a city for all, ensuring the best education for our children, and securing economic stability for years to come if we do not first guarantee that affordable housing is available for all who want it in our city.
Thank you, Mayor Reed.
Thank you.
So I am Lori Britt. I'm with the Institute for Constructive Advocacy and Dialogue at James Madison University. And I've been working with this group of collaborators, and I'll be moderating this discussion today and helping have some conversations in the community later on in the fall. So in this discussion today, we'll be hearing from a panel of people who work in various ways with issues of housing in our community. We're focusing on this discussion on both affordability and accessibility. So let's define what those mean. Affordable, according to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, is when people pay no more than 30% of their annual income for housing. But currently, 12 million renter and households in the country pay more than 50% of their annual income. If you're paying more than 30%, that's considered a burden. And that's going to impact a lot of things. And affordability is also impacted by not just the cost of your rent or your mortgage, but other ancillary costs like what you're close to, transportation costs. So accessibility is having properties or options available in your price range that are also close to jobs, transportation, schools, childcare, and a network of community. So the 5 panelists today are being asked to present kind of a narrow perspective from their perspective of how they work with housing, about the many interconnected facets of our housing system. The people who've asked to be on the panel today don't represent the full story of how different sectors of our community are impacted by housing and experience challenges with housing, but those stories are very individual. But these panelists can give us a sense of the system that we're dealing with. So I'm going to be asking each of the panelists 2 questions, and I'll introduce them when they answer the first question so that they can give you a little bit of a sense of this issue in its complexity. So our first question for each of the panelists is, what contributes to people being able to find and attain homes that they can afford? And first we'll hear from Renee Whitmore, who is a realtor and is also the former president of the Harrisonburg-Rockingham Board of Realtors.
Thanks so much, Lori. Affordability of homes boils down to basically one main factor, and that is supply and demand. It's kind of like economics 101. And currently in our local Harrisonburg and Rockingham County real estate market, we're seeing an extraordinarily small number of homes for sale. And with historically low interest rates and a growing population, we are seeing a high number of people that desire to purchase a home in our community, which is fantastic. It's awesome. As Mayor Dina Reed said, we've got a friendly city and folks want to be here in our community. So that's awesome. But this leads to competition, multiple offers, and that all pushes prices upward. And in essence, fewer houses means a rising price. One way in which low inventory supply can be offset is through new construction and building of new communities. The availability of land that can be used to build new homes is shrinking, and the process for developing raw land can be burdensome to investors that are willing to take the risk. These factors can lead to new construction homes coming on the market at a much higher price range, and that is adding in some of the higher density options for housing would allow for builders and developers to put more homes per acre and offset these costs in the long run. Another factor that is impacting the number of homes for sale are the homeowners themselves. In many cases, a homeowner that is thinking of selling their house, they wish to time that sale in order to get the highest price possible. Along those same lines, these homeowners are reluctant to sell their home if they don't have a replacement home to purchase due to the low number of homes on the market. You can see it's just this big cycle of not having enough houses. In other scenarios, homeowners are refinancing and making upgrades to their current homes, and they're just electing to stay put where they currently are. Obviously, this is totally oversimplifying this very complex issue, but this is what I'm experiencing in our local market and seeing in the day-to-day conversations with other real estate agents, homeowners, developers, purchasers, and all of those that are working within the real estate industry.
Thank you, Renee. Now we're going to hear from Tan Dang, who is the Assistant Director of Community Development for the City of Harrisonburg, who will talk a little bit about zoning and planning.
Thank you, Lori. So zoning is often brought up as a barrier to affordable housing because of regulations like single-family restrictions, mandatory minimum lot sizes, as well as high parking requirements. Zoning ordinances are basically land use regulations that with the purpose that's generally stated as for protecting the health, safety, and general welfare of the people in a community. What zoning does is it divides lands into zones or districts in which certain land uses are either allowed or prohibited, and it also regulates the location and the design of structures that are built on that land. Dividing land into different zones for different uses, such as residential, commercial, and industrial uses, can be useful when it separates things like industrial uses from residential uses because that protects people against pollution risk. However, zoning has been criticized for encouraging suburban sprawl as well as segregating people, in addition to creating barriers to affordable housing. However, I don't feel like it has to be this way. So today, best practices in planning and zoning are calling for change through more flexible approaches to land use regulation that would encourage diversity to help improve communities. And this would include things like providing diversity or allowing diversity of housing types to provide options to different types of people and different types of families, diversity of uses to get people closer to where they work and want to buy things that they need every day, as well as looking at diversity of transportation options so that driving isn't the only way that we have to get around our communities. And you may have heard of a term called upzoning. Basically, this might include things like allowing multi-unit or apartment buildings in neighborhoods that were traditionally single-family neighborhoods, or allowing homes to occupy a smaller land footprint. Upzoning could encourage the creation of more affordable housing. However, I feel it's important that communities like Harrisonburg consider potential unintended consequences that could result from upzoning. For example, Renee shared that higher density options that would allow more housing units per acre could lower the cost of housing by spreading the cost of that land across various households or multiple households. However, increasing density on its own might not drive down the price of housings if the developer is looking to build things like luxury apartments or luxury homes, or if the housing is marketed to college students who typically are willing to pay higher rents. Therefore, I feel it's important that policies, in addition to changing zoning regulations, are important to evaluate. So there are other many policies that we could evaluate that could help be part of that toolbox for creating more affordable housing. And what tools are appropriate for our community will be specific to our community. It will vary from one community to another. But on that note, I'd like to share with everyone that we do have a unique opportunity now ahead of us to evaluate and modernize the City of Harrisonburg zoning ordinances, as well as our subdivision ordinance, through an update project that was started in July 2020. To just give some context, the last time that these two ordinances were comprehensively evaluated were in 1997 and in 1996. So this is a very big, important legacy project that we have and a great opportunity.
Great.
Thanks,
Tom. Now we're going to hear from David Wenger, who's Executive Director of the Central Valley Habitat for Humanity, for a developer's perspective.
Thank you. As a small nonprofit home builder, our ability to create affordable housing for our hardworking families is contingent on our being able to build a house and keep the costs down. That's not unique to us as nonprofit home builders, but we know that any costs that we incur has a potential to be passed along, so we work really diligently on that. Wanted to look at development costs specifically in the home building process, and maybe even more specifically, the infrastructure cost. Historically, we have looked for ways to avoid the building of infrastructure, meaning water lines, sidewalks, those type of things, by building in areas where that is already provided. Even in that scenario, we know that the cost of permitting, the cost of paying taxes, the cost of hooking up to water and sewer adds about 10% to the cost of our homes. As we have tried to increase our building, we are looking at bigger projects. So I wanted to give you one example that may help people understand this a little bit better. We've made a proposal and are exploring a proposal with the City of Harrisonburg to build 42 homes within the city. The infrastructure cost for building sidewalks, running water, sewer lines, there are potential of $1.2 million. So if you do some division there by 42, that's $29,000 per home. If that is passed along, that's about 20% an increase on the home. So as you reference back to being able to afford a home or being cost burdened on the home that you discussed earlier as we got started, you do the calculations again, and the homeowner would have to earn $48,000 per year to be able to afford these homes. To give you a little bit more perspective on that, the base salary for police officers in the city is what I found on the internet was $47,000, and a teacher in the city would have to work 8 years before they pass that threshold to be able to afford that home. So that's just one example of how infrastructure could affect the cost for families working to get into affordable home with us. And obviously we can't pass that cost along to the homeowner. So it's going to be a team process to have to be able to work on that. Additionally, again, as I pull back on the development costs, and as I've talked to for-profit contractors, a lot of the development cost is up front even before you start breaking ground or building on that. And so you can get into a project, incur a good bit of development costs, and then for whatever reason, not be able to proceed with the project. Again, those costs have to be passed along in the for-profit arena. That might be accommodated on other projects. We just don't have the option to do that. So we are looking for ways to offset those costs. And as we do that, we explore options through local, state, and federal regulatory authorities and funding to help keep the costs down for that.
Great. Thank you, David. Now we're going to hear from a builder, Aaron Yoder, who's president of AM Yoder and Company Builders and former president of the Shenandoah Builders Association. Aaron.
Thank you, Lori. Well, as we've already heard from a lot of our other panelists, many complex economic factors contribute to the availability of and access to affordable housing. And my experience as a developer and a builder dovetails and fits right in with a lot of what we've heard before. So I won't cover all that same ground again. But working wages, property values particularly, which are determined by a whole other separate complex system of data points, are some of the barriers to affordable housing in Harrisonburg. one of the unique problems that I bump into as a developer and a builder related to property values is the property value system of appraising a property relevant to a potential buyer of a product I would build being able to get a bank loan. It's not connected really in any way to my cost as a builder to construct that property. So cost and value a lot of times are not in alignment, and that presents some challenges for clients that need to go to the bank and borrow money to build or buy their project. Other regulatory factors also play a role, but only some of those regulations are local. A lot of those regulations related to stormwater management and raw land development that maybe in a wetland or adjacent to public land. Those are state and federal regulations that everyone is subject to that would develop a property. Those are not necessarily unique and local problems, but they're still obstacles standing in the way of affordable construction, affordable new construction, because of the cost associated with developing property that adheres to those regulations. Harrisonburg is indeed a great place to live. It's an extremely desirable relocation market with some of these regulations that do limit new construction, driving up property values and costs to the point where a lot of new construction housing and even some existing housing is just not affordable as defined by the metrics that Lori laid out in the beginning. So those are some of the obstacles that I think we face locally.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. We'll turn last to Tashfia Hassan, who's coordinator of community impact for United Way of Harrisonburg and Rockingham County, to talk about some additional costs.
Yeah, thanks, Lori. In terms of affordability and accessibility, I really think of ATLAS, and that's an acronym that stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. Really refers to folks in our community who are working really hard, sometimes 2, even 3 jobs, but still struggling to make basic ends meet in our community. So recently we asked our ALICE Coalition, which is a coalition represented by folks from across sectors in our community, and who provide services ranging from education to housing to transportation. We asked them, what are some of the root causes of why your services are needed? And when we asked that, it was really interesting what we heard from these providers. We heard that there's a lack of trust in the community and accessing services. We know that there is wide-ranging discrimination and inadequate wages. So I'd like to touch on a couple of those pieces. We know that there are discriminatory practices that exist on all levels, ranging from policies that set people up from certain groups to fail, and even implicit biases that are carried by local service providers. So, for example, only in the last several months, there was a law that was passed that bans discrimination of different sources of funds. So essentially what that means is, let's say I had a housing voucher. Before, landlords could actually turn me away because that was my source of money to be able to pay my rent. However, now with this new policy in place, landlords will no longer be able to discriminate based on that source. We also know that there's a lot of racial inequities that we see. So for example, according to the organization Prosperity Now, 43% of white community members in Harrisonburg are homeowners, compared to just 13% of Black residents in Harrisonburg. So there's a really startling disparity there. There are a lot of factors that play a role in people not being able to access and afford housing. With inadequate wages, we know, according to the newly released ALICE report, that over 1.2 million jobs in Virginia pay less than $15 an hour. To give us some context to that, we know that according to that same report, the true, very basic cost of living in our community for, say, 2 adults and 2 school-age children, it requires the adults in that family to make closer to $30 an hour. So at that significant deficit, it can be extremely difficult to keep up with things like housing costs, utility costs, and it really forces a lot of people and families to forego keeping up with their houses to ensure that everyone can live safely in the home. So there are a lot of sacrifices that are routinely made because of the cost of housing.
Great. Thanks, Tashfia. So the second question I'll pose is, clearly this is a complex issue. There's no easy solutions, but that doesn't mean there aren't things that we could be doing. And so I'm going to ask each of the panelists, from your perspective, what change would be a priority to help address the challenges of the availability and access to affordable housing? And we'll go in the same order, and we'll start with Renee.
Thanks, Lori. So when I was posed this question earlier, I went to the source. I went to the real estate agents that I work with on a regular basis to ask their opinions and help me answer this question. And out of that conversation, I have two priorities of change that I see fitting to the discussion, and neither of which are going to be the proverbial like easy button. You know, of course, like anything else in life, it's going to be really difficult to fix this complex problem that we're working with. First, the process of development. It's arduous, it's costly, and those costs are passed on to the consumer. And that is going to impact the cost of the housing in the long run. So if the process of developing land and the permitting process could be more streamlined within the municipal entities, this could assist in making our area a little more developer friendly and lead to a less costly housing, on the back end. Other options could be incentivizing builders and developers that are in the affordable housing spectrum. I know we mentioned earlier, I think David mentioned about waiving tap fees or, doing grants and that sort of thing to connect to water and sewer, or just giving tax credits for such development that would fall within or under that certain price range that would be deemed affordable. Secondly, the perception of higher density development and what we refer to as NIMBYism. And what that means is not in my backyard. So there's this thought process or this, of not wanting to have development, or especially the higher density development in your backyard. Everyone gives lip service really to wanting less expensive housing. But when it comes to getting higher density communities approved, many folks in our community, they want to speak out against it because they just don't want that in their backyard. And it's going to take our industry as a whole to educate everyone from the community leadership all the way down to our residents, that in order for us to maintain homes that our residents can afford, we may need to think in terms of more houses on less land.
Great. Thanks, Renee. From a planning and zoning perspective, Tom, what are some ideas you've got?
Sure. So thank you. Community involvement and input, I feel, will be very important with the update of the city's zoning and subdivision ordinances. We've heard a lot of great ideas from, the other panelists. One of them that has been repeated is increasing allowable housing density on land. These could be changes to the zoning ordinance, such as allowing homes to occupy a smaller footprint of land by creating something that's called missing middle housing, which would be things like duplexes, townhomes, and small apartment buildings within a single family neighborhood. Or it could involve allowing accessory dwelling units, which is another term for things like basement apartments, in-law suites, or carriage houses that are put in backyards. All of these things I've heard from many people in our community that, these could be solutions to creating affordable housing opportunities. However, either these same or other community members may also have concerns and questions about how the additional housing could impact traffic, add children to our school system, or have an impact on the demand on the utilities that serve our community. So I feel the conversation that is around the zoning and subdivision ordinance update we need to continue to ask ourselves, what kind of community is it that we want? And then we have to be honest with ourselves in discussing what the changes are that are necessary to achieve those visions. And I'll also want to add that, the other panelists have brought up some other ideas to explore other policy tools. And I do agree that in addition to changing the zoning ordinance, that we should explore all of these other opportunities to create more affordable housing options for people in our community. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tom. David, what about your perspective from a nonprofit developer?
I too went to some of the folks, contractors, nonprofit folks, and for-profit folks, and I asked them about the issue. And I've heard some of the same themes that we've been talking about today. First, zoning, so I'm not going to spend too much time right here on that, other than to say there is work that has been done on that, and that's to be commended. for one example, that's the recent addition of R8 zoning within the city. That's a small lot residential zoning that allows for this increased density. So there are ideas out there that are being implemented that are moving that forward. So the zoning was the first thing that I referenced. Second was any way to clarify the implementation of any regulations that are going on. I mentioned earlier that the development engineering costs of projects can go a long way and cost a lot of money, and you can get a long way into a project and find out that you can't proceed with that. So not that I want to add layers of on top of layers, but any opportunity to have those discussions earlier rather than later so that they can avoid any of those costs. Thirdly, as I mentioned, the infrastructure costs and other costs can't go to the families or the individuals that are trying to get into affordable housing. If we want to keep the housing affordable, we need to look at other ways of funding, be unique in that, and maybe not unique because other areas are doing some of these, but we need to borrow from their examples. And the families can't support the costs. The city and county can't support the cost. It has to be a broad look at things and consider federal, state, local funding and alternatives to funding as well. So I say all that to say that we need to implement a process that allows these low income families that are working to be able to afford a home ways to defer, reduce the cost of things like water and sewer hookups, maybe some taxes for a time being on the home, down payment assistance, those type of things that contribute to the cost of the home. And I guess finally, since the deferment of fees is never free, as I mentioned, you're kind of moving pots of money around in some ways. The development and continuing to promote the concept of a housing trust fund, I think, is an idea that we need to push forward. Now that concept is a concept that there is a fund that's made and governed by a panel locally that determines how best to use the funds that are contributed from the private sector, the governmental sector, lots of different places. They determine how best to use those funds to promote affordable housing, whether that's new construction, whether that's rent support, or whatever the options are that are needed on that. So those would be the 4 ideas that I would come up with and promote.
Great, thank you, David. Aaron, what about from a builder's perspective?
So it's interesting. Originally, I answered this question similarly to some of the other panelists, which are extremely thoughtful and right on in their response. You know, I believe we do need also to examine some exceptions to regulatory and permitting, perhaps even zoning regulations on residential housing for affordable housing purposes. There are many opportunities in and around Harrisonburg for affordable housing developments. These developments must be profitable for the developers also, or there's no incentive to develop this type of housing despite the significant need. So that's kind of a summary of my initial response. However, as I listen to the thoughtful perspectives of my panelists, you know, an idea comes to mind. I think many of my colleagues around the state would say in response to this question, what change would be a priority? I think other builders and developers in other areas would say we need to change our attitude. And reading between the lines, what they mean is, you know, they don't live in an area where their locality really is motivated to be collaborative and creative to come up with solutions for housing affordability. I think we're tremendously fortunate to live in a locality that really does have that attitude, that building block already in place. I'll tell you just a very short story to illustrate that. I was on the phone recently with a potential partner on a project, a development project, on the phone with one of Tan's associates, and our conversation about the project in question was beginning to wind down, and I posed the question to the city, what other properties, or are there other properties in Harrisonburg that you would love to see developed into some kind of affordable housing? And the person that we were on the phone with, almost in anticipation of the question, said, well, I'm so glad you asked, because let me share with you what's on my spreadsheet. So even within the city of Harrisonburg administrative offices, there's a spirit of collaboration and desire, which is so critical and key, that they keep a running list of projects that they're just waiting for the right developer to come along and do something with. So I believe we're fortunate. We have the right attitude in place already. There are projects ready to be developed. I do believe, however, still though, that we have a lot working in our favor. I think the attitude is right. I think the creativity there, and I do think the opportunity is there. What we need now is to simply put it into action. And as David has done as a pioneer of the R8 zoning available in the city, having with Habitat already rezoned some property and blazed the trail for the rest of us, the developers have a responsibility to lead that process and find these properties that may be a little bit non-traditional, but that can collaborate with the city. And the city needs to continue to do what they're doing and partner with developers to think creatively, strategically about how to develop these projects that are ready there in town to be developed.
Great, thanks, Aaron. And finally, from kind of a human services perspective, Tashfia, what ideas do you have?
Yeah, I think resources come to mind. Unfortunately, we just need to invest significantly more resources into longer term solutions. So a kind of common challenge that we see with ALICE families, for example, is that because we have so few resources available in our community for housing solutions, we're often investing those resources in people that are experiencing the most housing crisis, for example. So let's say there's somebody that needs rental assistance. We basically force people to move into crisis before we can help them. And so that creates this, perpetual cycle of people being pushed into situations like homelessness before we can actually step in. So I'll just second David's thought around the Housing Trust Fund. I think if we could invest significantly in longer term solutions, that really would create a lot of positive change for our community. And I think we also need to think about accessibility in terms of safe housing as well. So we know from our Build United program that there are a large number of residents in Harrisonburg and Rockingham who are low-income homeowners and just don't have the support that they need to be able to keep up their homes in a way that's safe for them to live in. To Renee's point before, it is absolutely about supply and demand. And so we need to be thinking in the long term and make sure that the supply we do have now is kept up well, is safe and usable for the people in our community. And so, I think it's really about making sure that we have the resources in place for those longer term solutions. I'd also add that we, to Aaron's point, we are creative. I think we just need to commit to those to learning about creative solutions and actually implementing them. So, for example, I learned about this company that has almost these building block type homes that they build. And so you start with one building block and you can add 2 or even 3 blocks to it as the needs of your family grow or shrink. We know that over a lifetime, that changes for everyone. And so, that's just an amazing creative solution to have a home that is just much more flexible to someone's needs. And there are communities out there that are successfully implementing these really creative solutions. I think we just need to see those creative solutions and actually really just commit to them and be willing to be a little bit flexible as we explore creative options.
Great, thanks, Tashia. So where do we go from here? Clearly it's a complex issue. We've got some really exciting ideas and possibilities. So what does this mean and where do we go from here? So I'm going to turn it over to Bob Hill.
Well, what this means is that the conversation around housing affordability and availability continues to grow as inclusiveness expands and awareness of the need intensifies. There are many coalitions already grappling with this deepening problem. The next step is to invite your neighbors and friends to join the discussion and help us forge a systematic approach that the entire community can embrace. Ultimately, the more we talk, the more we find commonality and shared purpose of direction. Now is the time to link these various groups and perspectives into one focused drive for making the basic need of housing achievable for the largest number of residents possible. We ask that you become a part of the solution by joining conversations on various topics which have been highlighted in this presentation later in the fall. Don't wait for someone to do something about affordable housing. Join us now and help envision the solution.
And now, in order to kind of bring it back to a personal level, I'm going to invite David Wenger to share the story of someone who has experienced challenges with housing accessibility and affordability. David?
Thank you. If you get nothing else out of that, this is the why about what we're doing on looking at affordable housing. You know, we have families, strong families in the area who actually humble me because situations not of their own fault have often gotten them down, and they stand up and say, I'm not going to stay down, I'm going to work through this and find a way to take care of myself and my family. So they work hard and look for things, and they're not looking for a handout, they're looking for a helping hand. So that's what we're looking at, how we can give them. So it was hard for me to choose just one story. So the story I chose, though, demonstrated this over a period of time and demonstrated how it's told from the mother's perspective. So it's demonstrated how she took advantage of the full range of housing and opportunities that we have within the city and the county. So her story started as a young child. She moved around a lot. Their family moved around a lot. And even at that time, she knew that there was a stability in housing. And she started to think about what her forever home would look like. And she was thinking of ways that she could have her forever home. And as she got older and she had children of her own, obviously her thoughts turned to how can I keep my children safe? How can I get them in an affordable house? How can I keep my family healthy in a good housing? So as many of these stories go, things got worse before they got better, and she found herself homeless at times on that. So, but she kept working, kept fighting. She applied for housing through the housing authority within the city. After a waiting period, she was able to get into housing on that, took full advantage of the education process that's offered through that, learned how to work through, create savings, create situations, budgets that could help her towards her housing goals. And as time went on, she became aware of the program through Central Valley Habitat for Humanity, and she applied for that. So that's no simple feat to make 2 applications to 2 organizations and work your way through that. She says that she worked with those organizations. She's appreciative to those organizations, and she learned a lot about housing and how to get into her forever home. So I'm excited to also say, not the end of the story, but she is in her forever home now. And she knows that her own children will have housing stability, which in turn, we see that goes down, and children who have housing stability get better jobs, they get better education, they're healthier. I think that was mentioned before. So she has a real hope and joy for the situation that she's now in. And she deserves the credit for that. We were just the conduit to help her to get where she knew she needed to go with her family. And she is there now, and we'll be watching for great things out of her, and specifically her children. She has twins. So this will be a great thing to watch. And that was a great story, but there are multiple stories of that. There's just many other stories of folks that need that helping hand, and we hope we can give it to them.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And from all of us on the panel, thank you for engaging in this conversation. And we hope that you'll engage in the conversations this fall and continue to talk about these issues with your family and your colleagues and your friends. It's going to take us all. Thank you.